The Victorian era was a time of mass industrialization. People, pushed by poverty and pulled by prosperity, moved in their droves from the countryside and filled up the cities and their factories. The wheels of industry churned, and smoke and smog pumped into the air, and some cats began to grow fat. But whilst there was some prosperity, the Victorian era brought with it problems of social order, industrialization, poverty, and crises of faith. As the Victorian era brought with it industrialization, suddenly the general population moved on from the influence of their religious institutions and the church. The spires, which once dominated the skyline of the medieval city, were slowly replaced by smoking chimneys, pumping out smoke and smog. As time marched on, so with it brought substantial changes to technology, society, the economy and daily life. The former, simpler and slower times of the medieval period were disappearing in the rearview mirror, and with many dissatisfied with industrialization, so began the period of Victorian medievalism. Whilst we might think of the Middle Ages as a dirty, deranged and dangerous era, many Victorians believe that the Middle Ages, that is the years 500 to 1500 AD, possessed romantic notions of chivalry, honour, as well as a feudal order and monastic institutions. The Victorian perspective brushed past all those dirtier details and was revered for being an era, particularly in the purity of spirituality and fashion, and so stoked a revival and romanticism of art, architecture, politics and literature. Medievalism can be defined as the process of creating the Middle Ages. One of the best examples of medievalism in the Victorian era is that in the Gothic Revival of architecture, most notably in the design of the Palace of Westminster. Westminster Abbey has long been the site of celebration, coronation, with 16 royal weddings and hosting every coronation since 1066. One night in 1834, tally sticks used to write down messages were not properly extinguished and the Abbey blew up in flames and burnt the House of Commons and the House of Lords to the ground. A team of workers worked hard, risking life and limb to save Westminster Hall, which was the oldest part of the building. This tragedy happened at the same time as the Gothic Revival trend taking off. Perhaps the most iconic examples of this trend, perceived to be the beginning of the revival movement, was the building of the house of Horace Walpole at Strawberry Hill. Strawberry Hill is described as having a sense of gloom and warmth, a term coined by his maker Horace Walpole as a way to describe the sombre ambience of his little Gothic castle. This mock Gothic castle was built with the romanticism of European cathedrals and castles in mind. White walls are decorated with parapets and turrets and battlements in its exterior, with wallpapers and gilded details decorating the inside. It was subversive at a time of Palladianism, and it's within this context when talks came around to the rebuild of the Palace of Westminster, there was much appetite from the city's best architects to rebuild the palace in the same style as the original Westminster Abbey. Those in charge opened up the opportunity to a competition to design the new palace, with Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin submitting a design that seduced the board. Pugin was an iconic Gothic architect, described as fanatical, tireless, and a monumental workaholic, and described by a psychiatrist as having mania without psychotic symptoms. He was utterly obsessed with the medieval church architecture and quite puritanical about it, believing that there was a present decay of taste in declining architectural standards and the loss of spiritual inspirations he saw in medieval buildings, and in the moral superiority of the Gothic period. Pugin was set to design the interior of the palace, where he downed the walls with paintings of iconic medieval historical scenes and inspired art, from the portraits of Tudors to that of the Spanish Armada, which almost brought the country to its knees in the 17th century, also depicting the death of Horatio Nelson and the meeting of the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Butcher, which were the most important moments in the winning of the Napoleonic Wars. Pugin's values are a good example of this medieval revivalism, showing Victorian values expressed through romanticised storytelling and tales of conquest. This reflected well in the paintings in the court of King Arthur, showing values such as hospitality, generosity, mercy, religion and courtesy. The paintings of courage and fidelity could never be finished, and were to be replaced by portraits of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, creating a self-imposed link between themselves and the medievality they were reviving. This was also a period of medievalist literary activity and the revival of ballads. Perceptions of the Middle Ages, acts of chivalry, and the evolving role of women were influenced by classical historical fiction like Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and Alfred Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King. In this book, the characters grapple with individual desires and the expectations of society, and there was a rise in nationalism and interest in British and English heritage, particularly explored through the revival of Arthurian legends. The Enlightenment's focus on reason, science, and progress presumably took the romance out of life for some, who sought escapism through Gothic literature, which sparks a fixation on the mystic and supernatural. These books somewhat provide a corridor between the more advanced, more technical and rational type of society and the freer, less constrained Middle Ages, a seemingly simpler time despite its challenges. This nostalgia, this yearning for simpler times, is reflected through the work of John Ruskin and William Morris, who yearned for the craftsmanship of the age, already complaining that the wheels of capitalism were removing the creativity and authenticity in artwork. Ruskin saw the Middle Ages as a time of greater artistic originality, spirituality, and a time of more integrity. He saw that the quality of the nation's architecture reflects the nation's spiritual health. Also a proponent of the Gothic style of architecture and its associated workmanship, he grieved the loss of traditional ways, wanting to revive traditional craftsmanship and reject mass industrialization. William Morris, a disciple of Ruskin, was inspired by his study of architecture in the Gothic Revival, and penned a book of poetry called The Nature of Gothic and In Defense of Guinevere, and made medieval-inspired furniture, wallpaper, and stained glass windows. Medieval revivalism also included fashion. The Victorians understood that how one dressed influenced their place in the world, even going as far to say that it had a spiritual impact on them. Man's earthly interests are hooked and buttoned together and held up by clothes. Man's body and the cloth are a site of materials whereon and whereby his beautified edifice of a person is to be built. Dress becomes a symbolic language. Elizabeth Eastlake writes in 1847, "The Victorians became enamoured with rich, heavy fabrics like velvet, often embroidered with vines and crosses, and deep jewelled tones that were reminiscent of royalty and medieval art. It was about being demure. The sleeves were large and the necklines were high. Women wore their hair in braids, often wearing veils and hairnets made of gold thread of pearls. Skirts flowed, and corsets and bodices were recreated in a way reminiscent of medieval kirtles." Queen Victoria herself was obsessed with King Arthur and tales of medieval romances. This era provided an escapism from the demands and dangers of an industrialized city. It provided a promise of purer and more nobler time that was more connected with nature, in a time that was polluted, in a time that was drenched with smoke and smog. That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this look at medieval revival in Victorian Britain. If you liked this episode, please give us a like and subscribe for more. I bring out new episodes every Tuesday. Goodbye.